My name is Andy Schwarz, and I am one of the founding partners of OSKR, an economic consulting firm. I hold an MBA from the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, as well as a bachelor's degree in history from Stanford. I have been practicing for 24 years as an economist, specializing in antitrust, and I have served as an economic expert in a variety of state and federal litigations. Because of the cases I've worked on, including cases involving the NFL and the NCAA, most notably the O'Bannon and Alston cases, I've developed a subspecialty in sports economics, targeted at the economics of college athletic programs. I've testified on issues of college sports economics to Congress, as well as several state legislatures. I've consulted, formally or informally, for several athletic departments faced with questions of determining the true financial cost and benefits of their athletic programs, most notably the University of Alabama, Birmingham. In April, at MIT's Sloan Analytics Conference, I presented some of my conclusions about the ways in which college athletic departments accounting can understate university-wide revenue. I've also published in popular press and academic journals on these issues. The bottom line of my report is that the Carr report overstated the benefits of moving to D3 and understated the costs. So where Carr sees over $14 million per year in reduced costs from moving to D3 from day one, at best, for the first 5 years, I see about $1 million in total savings. And I also see over $20 million in transition costs that Carr didn't include. So what looks like an obvious choice in Carr is a lot more suspect once the errors and questionable assumptions are corrected or reassessed. The first thing to note about the Carr report is what it's not. Despite the title, it's not a feasibility study, because it makes no effort to determine whether Hartford's current athletic program is a sustainable path forward or not. Instead, it takes as a mandate from Hartford that it should assume D1 is simply not viable, and it also takes as a given, does no assessment of the validity of this claim, that D1 athletics provides no real benefit to Hartford. As a consultant, I can tell you that if you start with the assumption that a given activity is unsustainably expensive and provides negligible value, then of course the focus is going to be on canceling that valueless activity and doing something different. But as a consultant, I would say that if I were told to assume those things, my first reaction would be to push back and ask what the school's basis for those assumptions are, and whether in fact a better research agenda might be to test those assumptions and either verify them or disprove them and see whether a viable D1 path exists. There's no inquiry into whether a D1 Hartford in the America East can be made more financially sound. That turns the entire exercise into something very different than a feasibility study, more like a form of marketing for a new agenda than an objective assessment of the truth. My report has 4 big ticket items that lead me to have different conclusions than the Carr report. The first, as mentioned, is there's no assessment in Carr of the transition cost to Hartford for making the move to D3. I calculate that conservatively to be at least $20 million upfront. The second is that there's simply a math error in Carr that leads to a $6.2 million overstatement of expenses. The third is a misclassification of a non-sports change in academic aid as if that were related to the move to D3. It's basically a red herring because those savings can be achieved in D1 or D3. Finally, I make a different assumption about how quickly Hartford can get its athletic program back to full speed after the switch to D3. I assume it will take at least 5 years to bring the program back to the same size it was at the end of the D1 run. The first of these, the upfront costs, is pretty easy to explain. I was given information on several family estate plans, which show that at least $15 million of bequests are contingent on Hartford staying in D1. That single fact alone, that the proposed move will cost the school $15 million, wipes out the first 7 years of what the purported savings are from the move. And that's not even counting other exit costs like $1 million fee to leave the America East. From this fact alone, I would think the board would want to investigate these claims and find out as best as possible how much higher the true number is than my conservative estimate before making an irreversible decision that would cost the school tens of millions of dollars. As for the math error, It may be a little hard to get your head around it at first, but essentially, CAR is charging twice for each dollar of scholarship aid given to athletes. It deducts the scholarships on the central administration side of the ledger, but then it deducts them a second time on the athletic side. And I have an example that can illustrate how this works. Imagine a single athlete who gets about a 70% scholarship. So the athlete pays 30% of the list price of tuition. Imagine that somehow you could charge that one student $100,000 more in tuition, at least as the list price, so that after the discount, that particular student would pay $30,000 more to the university. Clearly, that is a benefit to Hartford. Hartford would gain $30,000 from the change. But under the economics in the CAR report, it looks like Hartford actually loses $40,000. What happens is CAR takes the $100,000 and deducts the discount of $70,000 and says the student pays $30,000. But then it separately says, plus there's a secondary expense of another $70,000. It makes the transaction look like Hartford is losing $40,000. When you compound that single example across over 300 athletes, you get an overcount of expenses of about $6.2 million. The misclassification involves an assumption that Hartford will start giving athletes less academic aid in the D3 scenario. Hartford currently gives out a lot of academic aid to athletes, even to athletes who get zero athletic scholarships, that is, to walk-ons. CAR assumes that Hartford will go from giving about 67% of tuition to athletes who get no athletic aid to 57%. But my thesis is if you can lower academic aid to non-scholarship athletes in D3, there's no reason you couldn't do the same for walk-ons in a D1 scenario. So I remove those savings from the analysis because they're really unrelated to the move to D3. It might be a wise move, but it's something that can be accomplished in D1 or in D3. As for the assumptions about the need for a ramp up, CAR assumes that in the 2021-22 school year, that is fiscal year 22, Hartford will have a full-blown program with around 325 athletes. And then on June 30, 2022, that program will end and be replaced on the next day, July 1, 2022, with a full-blown D3 program with entirely different coaches, making a lot less in salary, entirely different athletes, and possibly entirely different sports. They also assume zero expenses related to D3 prior to July 1, 2022. So it's not like there's some assumption that there's a ramp up going on in the background. I just don't think that's going to happen. I was involved in analyzing UAB's football program. They took a 6-month pause from FBS, but it took over 2 years for the football team to recover. Now, there's a good argument that Hartford as a D3 program might never reach 325 athletes. But in my work, I assume Hartford does reach the 325 D3 athlete level, but that it takes 5 years to get back to that size. As a result, the hypothesized benefits take a lot longer to materialize, meaning that the D3 program is a lot less lucrative in my analysis over the first 5 years.
The result is where CAR implies that D1 currently costs Hartford $9.8 million, after you include the benefits to Hartford of athletes paying part of their own tuition, etc. I find that the net cost to Hartford of its D1 program will be a much lower $3.6 million.
And where CAR hypothesizes that from day one, the D3 version of Hartford will actually generate $4.5 million from athletics, I conclude over those first 5 years, it's more likely to be an average expenditure of $2.6 million. That is, it's about $1 million different. As a final point, I'd like to leave you with a question of terminology and even athletic philosophy. If you think that spending $3.6 million per year on a D1 program or spending $2.6 million per year on a D3 program is a subsidy, or it means that Hartford is losing money on sports, I think you're framing the decision in the wrong way. If D1 sports cost $3.6 million per year, there's no way to know whether that's a gain or a loss without answering the parallel question of whether the school is getting $3.6 million in benefit from the program or not. If you are, it's not a subsidy in an economic sense. It's simply an expenditure to receive fair value. If you were to hire a professor to teach classes, you could say, well, we're subsidizing the professor. But instead, you typically think of it as differently, as you're paying the professor a fair price for quality academic services. The same is really true for either D1 or D3. They're both likely to cost Hartford money. So as you decide which path to take, it's helpful to ask which is the better decision on how to spend money. It's not useful to denigrate all of that spending as a total loss, unless you think that Hartford with no athletics at all would be just as vibrant a community as it is with sports. So as you figure out the costs, you're really only halfway to the answer. You need to also understand the benefits and weigh the relative benefits of the two programs against the relative costs. The Carr report is silent on the whole second half of the analysis. And in my view, Hartford has to know the answer to that half before it can make an informed decision about anything. Thank you very much.